Hi everyone, I'm Stan Mallow. Welcome to Paranormal Yacker. My guest in today's show is Dr. David Shoemaker. I'll be talking with him about his book, The Way of the Will, Thelema in Action. Dr. Shoemaker, welcome to Paranormal Yacker.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
You, David, are a clinical psychologist in private practice, specializing in Jungian and cognitive psychotherapy. You're also a chancellor and prolocutor of the Temple of the Silver Star, a Thelemic initiatory and educational organization. In addition, you've been long involved with the Ordo Templi Orientis. It's an occult secret society and hermetic magical organization, and have many years of experience training initiates in these traditions. When, David, did you become interested in the occult, and what sparked that interest?
It's things begin strangely often. I find I've encountered a lot of people who tend to get into magic much earlier in their lives, in their teens or so. And I dabbled slightly with it, but mainly I was emerging out of college, a psychology major, heading off to graduate school to get my doctorate in clinical psychology. And at that point, I was more or less an atheist. I had been raised loosely Methodist, and knew that wasn't a fit for me, but I wasn't sure that I didn't realize actually that I was looking for a spiritual path. So I had encountered Carl Jung in my psychology studies and was very much influenced by his work. At some point, I became aware of the Western ceremonial tradition, at least as represented by the Golden Dawn and Israel Regardie and writers like that. So Regardie was very interested in Jung, and I found a Regardie book called The Middle Pillar, which talked about and kind of overlaid the Jungian model of the psyche on the Kabbalistic tree of life. And this just blew my head apart because I was so excited about the overlap of magic and psychology that I didn't even realize it existed. So Regardie and that book were kind of my gateway into ceremonial practice. And it wasn't long after that I discovered the work of Aleister Crowley, because Regardie, of course, had been a secretary and student of Crowley's in the 1920s, and continued throughout Regardie's life to write about him. So that's kind of the twisted journey of finding Thelema and really finding out that I wanted and needed a spiritual path.
In The Way of the Will, you explore how the spiritual discipline of Thelema, founded by Aleister Crowley, can be utilized to enhance one's psychological and spiritual growth. What, David, was your reason for focusing your book on the spiritual discipline of Thelema?
My earlier book, called Living Thelema, laid some foundations in terms of basic practice, basic theories, and doctrines that tend to be associated with Thelema, such as the idea of the true will. Thelema is the Greek word that means will. What I always strive to do in my writing and in my podcast episodes, the Living Thelema podcast, is to try to be practical, to try to make things approachable, to try not to, I'm not into, for the purposes of writing and podcasting, I'm not into history. I'm not into debating system versus system or things like that. What I want to do is, when someone reads a book of mine, I want them to come away with a sense that this is something that is doable by them, that is understandable by them, that can be practiced in a fairly efficient way. So Living Thelema had a little bit more of the foundations. This expands on it with a broader array of topics, if you will. But the basic impulse is to try to help people understand as best they can the true will, which, if I may, I'll say a couple words about to clarify what that is from a Thelemic standpoint. It's one of the most often misunderstood aspects of Aleister Crowley's system, so I like to address it a little bit. The idea of his phrase, which is kind of famous now, "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law," is that each human being has a central truth about themselves, a basic nature, a way of being that is uniquely theirs. And for each of us, according to the Thelemic doctrine, the best we can do in the world, the best we can do in our lives, is to discover our basic nature and to try to seek out a life that allows us to live it out fully and joyously and peacefully and in harmony with other people, giving them plenty of room to do their thing. At its root is basically a philosophy and, for some, a religious approach of honoring our central truth as humans, finding that, honoring it, leaving other people room to do that as well. And it is not do whatever you want. That's the most common misunderstanding. Do what thou wilt means do what your basic nature demands you do. Be who you are, to put more colloquially, and live a life where you live out who you are.
The way of the will is divided in parts. And what I'll do now, David, is touch base with you on each of those parts. Here goes. Part 1, Thelema and the life within, reflects on the ways one's inner experience can be enhanced by tools such as the Kabbalistic tree of life, Kabbalistic psychology, and the symbolic world of astrology. In what ways, David, can one's inner experience be enhanced by those tools?
Kabbalistic psychology, to me, and all 30 years-ish of my professional practice, has the most detailed and nuanced way of understanding what the human psyche is about and what the interface is between the everyday human ego and the spiritual source, however we name that and however we experience that. Unpacking the meanings of Kabbalistic psychology for people and helping them develop an inner language that they can use to understand themselves is crucial to peeling away those illusions and societal misconceptions that kind of make us diverge from our true will, that confuse us about what we're supposed to do, in quotes. And so Kabbalistic psychology is an incredibly useful tool for self-understanding and growth in that way. The other thing with the Kabbalistic tree of life, of course, is that training orders like the Temple of the Silver Star and Crowley's order called AA, not Alcoholics Anonymous, but a different AA, they modeled their training system on the tree of life. So you have structured series of degree or grade experiences that train you according to the different spheres and paths on the tree. And this, again, becomes a way of internalizing an internally consistent symbol system of self-understanding and magical practice that is entirely in harmony in terms of the way we can understand the self through Kabbalistic psychology and the true will. All of these tools are just that, tools. They lead us to the true will. And if they don't lead us to the true will, that's not a tool we probably need to mess with.
In part 2, Thelemic practice in detail, tips are shared for constructing powerful, customized, magical invocations, coping with the ordeals that impact one along the path of their great work. Can you, David, share some of those tips, and what are you referring to when you say great work?
Great question. The great work is a term we often use to describe the overall path of developing self-knowledge and moving toward a spiritual awakening. Now, this has many different symbols that are used for it, many different terms that are used depending on the system that you're specifically working. But big picture is the great work is the big story of us discovering who we are, discovering our true will, uniting the ego self with the spiritual self in one way or another. That's the convenient term for that. In the rest of part 2, some of the tools like the advanced Thelemic meditations that aren't talked about as often I try to go into those in some detail. I talk about the Gnostic Mass, which is the central public ritual of the Ordo Templi Orientis. Talk about the Golden Dawn tradition, which was seminal to all of Western occultism since the late 1800s. Topical chapters like looking at creative, effective, magical invocations, how to use all of the tools of poetry, our spiritual understandings of the hierarchies of spirits in the world and so on to make the most of bringing in a particular kind of energy through an invocation. So there's a whole chapter on that. There's a chapter on healing, finding a teacher when you're looking for one, helping you try to figure out what's the best training school for you. And the most important task of any Thelemite in terms of magical practice and spiritual advancement is what we term the knowledge and conversation of the holy guardian angel. It's important not to get bogged down in the words here. The idea is this is the ultimate, for most humans, the ultimate spiritual awakening experience where we have as I said, a connection between the aspiring ego self and the central spiritual truth of who we are. This is often experienced as an encounter with an external being of some kind, but the label's not important, and everyone knows what's happening when they get to it through their own experience. The key point I'm making here is there is my own personal memoir about the experience of the Holy Guardian Angel that I had most concretely and consciously beginning in 2004. So it's sort of my personal story of that awakening experience. So all of the tools, again, if they're useful tools, it's because they are helping a person discover who they are and discover their true will and leading them to that central truth.
You've touched on some of the next questions I was going to ask you, but perhaps we can elaborate a bit. In part 2 of your book, David, you also examine the deeper personal magic accessible via attendance of the Gnostic Mass and the ways of the symbolic frameworks of the original Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn can be adapted to express and enhance Thelemic principles and practices. For those who may not be aware of the Gnostic Mass, can you, David, explain what it is, how is it performed, and in what ways does it differ from other types of masses that most people might be familiar with?
So the Gnostic Mass, as I briefly referenced before, is the central public and private ritual of Ordo Templi Orientis. It was written by Aleister Crowley around 1912 or 13, if my memory is serving at the moment. And it wasn't performed that much until the 60s, but since the 60s, since the Reformation of OTO in the 60s, it's been performed regularly around the world. It is in part derived from some of the same formulae that we'd see in other historical traditional masses. There are influences from Greek ritual, from Roman Catholic ritual, from Egyptian concept. As with much of Crowley's work, a lot of finding the best tools from different systems and putting them together in a cogent way.
In the book there, you review the ways in which Thelemic can inform a person about their health, their creativity, their sense of connectedness and meaning, and their experience of the nature of life itself. Can you, David, expand on that?
As we become more consciously in touch with our true will, our basic nature, a few things naturally follow from that. The idea is that the true will is our individual expression of universal will, if you want to call it the will of the divine. And that means that when we follow the path of who we are, the path of true will, we are inherently in harmony with what the universe is trying to kind of get to happen anyway. This is why it's important as a magical doctrine. Any magician has to be operating in harmony with higher forces in order to channel them and not fighting against them. If you're trying to swim upstream in a magical sense, it's not going to work as well. So you find where the current is of natural progression of life through knowledge of your true will, and then you make choices to honor that. So when it comes to things like creativity, when we are most open to who we are at our center, I have found we are most able to put creative tools into play. So a musician or an artist who knows themselves better will be a better channel for the music or the art to express itself through them. With things like healing, I think it's pretty well known with the state of science at this point that if we are at odds with ourselves, living a stressed out life and not taking good care of ourselves physically and not making choices to live a life that we feel good about and find meaning from, then we get sick and we stay sick and we make others around us sick mentally or physically. And the more we can live out the true will, therefore, the more we have a peaceful, healthful, and harmonious life that allows us to experience less stress and be healthier overall. Some nuances of true will is applied to healing there too. So that's just a couple of the topics, but I wanted to address those.
Now, my next question also you've touched on, but I'll ask it. In your book, you include a personal memoir of your own path toward awareness of true will, including your experience of the knowledge and conversation of the Holy Guardian Angel, the term, as you stated, used by Crowley to describe the pivotal spiritual awakening potentially available to every human being. Now I'm pausing. Okay. What, David, was your experience of the knowledge and conversation of the holy guardian angel?
The chapter in the book goes into quite a bit of detail on that, including the lead up to it and the experience during and after. But I guess the best way to neatly summarize that would be that it, for me, was the pivotal marking point between sort of my spiritual adolescence and spiritual adulthood, in terms of the inner life, in terms of knowledge of myself, in terms of finding what the path of the rest of my life was going to look like. The information from the angel that came to me starting in sort of throughout the retreat, sort of magical retreat period that goes along with these things. The information that started coming through reshaped the way I even think about who I am and what my choices are. So when we encounter with more clarity what we're here to do, then the immediate challenge is, all right, now I know what I'm supposed to be doing. How do I do it? How do I make my life a container for that? So we start to make choices that sometimes may be difficult ones about relationships or careers or where we live or what we spend our time doing, because we want to best honor the true will. Think about the true will as like the human equivalent of what a plant or an animal is here to do. So a tree, you plant a seed, it grows a certain way. The particular seed you planted determines what kind of tree it is. There's no question about what that tree is supposed to be doing. For a human, we get in our own way. And that's why it's so important to have this spiritual awakening where we can get out of our own way and discover what kind of force of nature we are, like a tree or an animal or wind or water. We're here to do a particular thing. And once we can clear away the obstacles to that, which are for humans, mostly ego obstacles and things like that, then things tend to fall into place. And so my experience with the HGA, which again became much more concrete and conscious in 2004 and has grown since then through continued work, my experience has been, it showed me who I am and what to do here. It showed me what not to waste time with. It helped me refine through some sometimes pleasurable, sometimes painful experiences, what my life was going to be about.
You mentioned in The Way of the Will that there are various opportunities for community engagement and training in Thelemic magic and mysticism. Can you, David, tell me what are some of those opportunities?
The orders that I most directly administer, first and foremost, the Temple of the Silver Star, which is a magical training organization that's an initiatory organization that's got lineal heritage back to the original Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, but is also fully Thelemic in its approach. So Tree of Life, Kabbalistic Tree of Life degree structure, where you go through with magic, meditation, reading, writing, ritual, group ritual, connected to the stage of the path you're at, and really get a foundational training there. So Temple of the Silver Star takes people maybe who are brand new to magic, or people who are very experienced, and walks them through a particular set of tools and experiences designed to help them identify their true will and live it out. We have groups around the US and around the world. You can go to totss.org for an FAQ and contact addresses and things like that. But it's a group initiatory experience with individual components that can be done by people anywhere in the world. As long as you can come and have your initiation at least once a year or so, or an advancement, then you can go back to Antarctica if you live there and do your practices privately and come back next year for your next advancement. So it's open to at-large participation like that. The other organization I would point out is the one Crowley himself founded in 1907 or so, called the AA, which people usually render as one spelling or another of words meaning Silver Star. So it's a different organization from Temple of the Silver Star, but the Temple of the Silver Star is in service to it as a overarching spiritual HQ, I guess. But AA is one-to-one training. You have one teacher who you work with. There are a couple group rituals early on, initiatory rituals, but for the most part, it's entirely solitary. So it's not there's no social component to AA. There are no groups or lodges or anything like that associated with AA. So for those who maybe are more interested in, cut out for a one-to-one solitary path with one teacher, you might want to think about AA, and the way to contact AA is onestarinsight.org. So those are some of the most prominent training options available.
Also addressed in your book, David, is the fact that Crowley's teachings have evolved over time. How has it changed?
As with any living tradition, you have succeeding generations of teachers and students and discoveries from everyone's inner experience. That's one of the beautiful things about the way Crowley understood this approach and the tools he left behind, is that everyone has to make up their own mind about what things mean. There's no pre-digested, here's what you must believe kind of thing in the way we might be used to and with some creeds from traditional religious approaches. So with each new student, there's a new opportunity for something to be added to the Thelemic body of work. In particular, across the 20th century, of course, Crowley died in 1947. In the time since then, everybody knows how much the world has changed since 1947. If you can imagine, we've had developments in modern psychology and science and physics, and just our way of understanding what the world even is, that then become useful reference points within a spiritual path that Crowley couldn't have predicted. So there's that kind of growth too, sort of societal evolution alongside magical evolution.
What, David, do you hope readers of The Way of the Will take away with them after they read it?
My central hope for everyone encountering anything I do is that they'll be inspired to follow their own path of self-discovery. This is not about creating some sort of cookie cutter uniform result for every person. It's about using these tools to get people to discover themselves and to come to their own conclusions about life and the universe. And hopefully through that self-discovery process, actually live out a life that is more joyous and harmonious and passionate. When we're doing what we love and we're doing what we're really about, we're passionate about it, and it shows, and it's kind of contagious in a good way. You know, we want to be around people who really just are digging what their life is about and doing it well. So most centrally, that's my hope, that anyone who's reading The Way of the Will or any of my other stuff gets energized with that path of finding themselves.
Should viewers of Paranormal Yacker want to buy The Way of the Will, Thelema in Action, and also learn about the services you offer, how can they do that?
Okay, so the Way of the Will, along with my previous book, Living Thelema, are both published and available easily in online booksellers, Amazon, etc. From Wiser Books, Red Wheel Wiser. I have another book called The Winds of Wisdom it's also available on Amazon. So lots of resources out there.
Perfect. David Shoemaker, I thank you for being my guest on Paranormal Yacker. It has been a wonderful experience yakking with you.
Thank you for having me.
Hi, everyone. This is Stan Mallow, the Paranormal Yacker. I hope you enjoyed the interview you just watched. So that you don't miss any upcoming shows, be sure to subscribe to my free YouTube channel. To do that, just press the subscribe button on your screen.